Hello and welcome to Change of Covenant Academy. Hello friends, this is David L. Henderson, and this is episode 4 of Change of Covenant Academy. If you've watched or listened to the previous episodes, you know what we're doing here. We're in the process of laying out some information concerning the covenants that God has made with human beings on earth. When Adam and Eve fell in the Garden of Eden, sin entered into the world and interfered with the relationship that God had with his children. Adam and Eve, in fact, the entire human race, were intended from the very beginning to be God's own family, his children. And when Satan came in with his deception, with his lies, with his trickery, his temptations, and he lured Adam and Eve into sin, and that relationship between God and his children was interfered with. And everything from about chapter 3 of Genesis forward to today has been all part of the plan that God has to get us back to the place where we can be his children, where we will once again be his full-blood family. And so that's so these are stages in that plan. Now God began, we were talking the last time in episode 3 about some of the individual covenants that God made with various people before he approached Abraham. And we talked about how that God made individual covenants with people. Now that means that when God, for instance, when God approached Cain and Abel, he instructed them how to build an altar, how to make sacrifice, and when they did that, when they performed those sacrifices, we find that Cain's sacrifice was not acceptable to God because it was a sacrifice of the fruits of his labor in the field. He was a tiller of the soil, and we don't know what it was exactly that he brought, fruits, vegetables, grains, crops, whatever it was that he was raising in the fields. And Abel was bringing of his livestock. And so there was a blood sacrifice that Abel made that Cain did not make, and God was not pleased with Cain's sacrifice, and so that caused trouble between them, ended up in the death of Abel. And in fact, if you continue on and read that story, Cain ended up with a better relationship with God than he had had before because he came to God in repentance, crying out for mercy, and God had mercy upon him. We find that their brother, Cain and Abel's brother, Seth, was a man of God. The scripture says that in the days of Seth, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. So Seth picked up where Abel had left off and was in a relationship with God. We're not told specifically that there was a covenant relationship, but we do know that because of the presence of sin in mankind, there has to be a blood sacrifice. The book of Hebrews tells us without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. And so God was not able to enter into a relationship with human beings unless there is a blood sacrifice. That's the reason why God did not accept Cain's sacrifice of the fruits of his tilling of the soil. That's the reason. This is why we can know when we look at Seth, when we look at Enoch, and various people down through that pre-Abrahamic line, a pre-flood line, we know that those people had covenant relationships with God, because without the shedding of blood, there is no relationship between fallen man and a righteous God. And so we find from Seth through Enoch and on into Noah, Noah's flood, and all of the human race was wiped out with the flood except for Noah and his family. So there were 8 people saved through the flood, and that was Noah, his wife, the 3 sons, and their wives. And so afterward, we know that God entered into a covenant relationship not just with Noah and his family, but with all living things on the planet Earth. And he set a rainbow in the clouds as a sign of his covenant with the inhabitants of this earth, both men, human beings, and animals, that says that never again will he destroy the inhabitants of the earth with a flood. And that's important because when the clouds come and when rain falls from the sky, we don't have to run in terror for fear that God is about to destroy the earth by water. That rain becomes a blessing. It's the means by which we grow our crops, the means by which we live and survive and thrive on planet Earth. And God does not want rain to become a horror and a terror to us. It is not a symbol of God's wrath. It is a symbol of God's blessing. And the rainbow is that promise that He will never again destroy the inhabitants of the earth by water. We got into Job a little bit last time. We talked about how that when we look at the relationship that Job had with God, it is obviously a covenant relationship because he built altars and he made blood sacrifices, burnt offerings to the Lord. But as we examine his relationship with God, we find that it is far different from the covenant that Abraham had. When God approached Abraham with a covenant, that covenant was far different from anything God had done before. And when we look at Job, we find that Job's covenant was a pre-Abrahamic covenant. It was not the kind of thing that God did with Abraham. And so we put Job in the timeline of history between the flood of Noah and the calling of Abraham. It's maybe a minor point now, several thousand years later, but it's something that we need to understand. We need to understand that we have a relationship with God that is different even from the relationship that Abraham and the Israelites had in the Old Testament. And I might just stop here for a second and say something about the difference between the testaments and the covenants. Okay? When we open our Bibles, we find a number of books in the Old Testament, and then we find a blank sheet of paper, and then we find a series of books in the New Testament. And we tend to think that the Old Covenant covers the Old Testament and the New Covenant covers the New Testament, but that is not exactly the way it is. What we find is that the Abrahamic covenant, which began in the 12th chapter of Genesis and continues on through to the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, the new covenant taking place, at least as far as I can tell, on the day of Pentecost with the coming of the Holy Spirit, which gave birth to the church age. So the 3 years that Jesus spent ministering on this earth was a transition period. It was the last 3 years of the old covenant. Every human being that Jesus ever preached to, everybody he healed, everybody he touched, everybody that he brought back from the dead, every miracle that Jesus performed, every word that he preached, everything that he taught, even his own 12 disciples were under the old covenant. Jesus himself was bound by the law of Moses throughout his ministry. And we also find that when Jesus rose from the dead and came back in something like a glorified body, that after his resurrection, he did not ever perform any miracle after that. I'm talking about healing sick or raising the dead or anything like that. He did no ministry miracles. He did, we know at one point, walk into a room where the door was locked and bolted. And apparently, locked doors were not a barrier to him. He could come into a room without going through the door. He talked about having flesh and bones, but he did not talk about having blood at that point. Well, why not? Because all of his blood was laying at the foot of the cross there on Mount Calvary. He had poured out his blood for us. And so when he comes back in a glorified body, he is no longer a natural human being as he had been before. I mean, his physical body was not that of a natural human being as it had been before, with the exception that his natural human body did not have this sinful blood of Adam flowing in its veins. We must make that point right here. We're not talking about that, though. That's not what we want to get into in detail right now. We're talking now about the word covenant. That's the subject of today's episode. If you were to find a Black's Law Dictionary, Black's Law Dictionary is the standard reference work for anybody in the legal profession. If you're a judge, if you're a lawyer, if you're a legal aid, if you're a legal secretary, anybody that has to do with the law profession is going to have access to a Black's Law Dictionary. And I don't have one. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not in the legal profession, but I know how to find them. And I was in a bookstore one time, actually, a number of years ago, and I found Black's Law Dictionary on the shelf. I pulled it out and I opened it up to find out what the word covenant means according to today's legal profession. And Black's Law Dictionary says that a covenant is a contract or a formal agreement, period. That's all it has to say, okay? When Moses wrote the book of Genesis and he began to talk about covenants, and the first use of the word covenant is there in chapter 12. No, it's not. Chapter 12 is where God first makes covenant with Abraham. The first use of the word covenant is back, I believe, in chapter 9 when God is speaking to Noah after the flood. He begins to mention covenants there. And so, I'm doing this off the top of my head. I didn't happen to have that in my notes. But the word covenant in today's English, in modern 21st century English, has a legal definition, and that is a contract or a formal agreement. Two people get together, and one person wants something done. He wants the other person to do this job, and he's willing to pay a certain amount. So they hammer out an agreement. I'm going to do this and this and this, and you're going to pay me parts and labor and whatnot over here. And so they get together, and they may negotiate. They may haggle a little bit. Well, if you do this, well, then I'll pay you this much. Well, if I do this, I'd like to do this as well, and then you can pay me a little more. Well, no, if I'm going to do that, you have to. And they give and take back and forth until they hammer out an agreement that both of them agree to. That's the point of having a formal agreement. And in actuality, a contract like that is there to bind together two people who ordinarily would either be reluctant to do the things spelled out in this contract, or they might agree to it and then change their mind later and decide not to do it. And so the agreement, the contract, binds them together and forces them to do something even if they've decided they don't want to do it. Okay? This guy's going to fix my plumbing, and I'm going to pay him parts and labor for the job. When he fixes my plumbing, I look at the job. I like the job. I'm glad he did it, but I really don't want to pay that much money. And so I decide to pay him just part of what I owe him. And so he takes that covenant, that contract, and he goes down to the courthouse and he approaches the judge, and the judge enforces that contract just exactly as if that contract was a law of the state of Indiana. You understand that? It forces us to do what we said we would do, even if we're reluctant to do it, even if we've changed our minds, even if we've decided not to do it. The judge is going to make sure that once you sign your name on that dotted line, you are bound to do what you said you would do. It's a very sober thing to sign a contract, okay? When I was looking at the covenant that God made with Abraham, God said this. He said, "For me, as for me, this is what I'm going to do for you." And he began to list the different ways he was going to bless Abraham. And I began to look at that, and I thought, well, what is Abraham's part of this contract? If this is an agreement, if this is a contract that God and Abraham have joined together into this covenant agreement, what is Abraham's part of the covenant? And I couldn't find it. What God said to Abraham was, keep this covenant. And he said more than that. He said, teach this covenant to your children and to your children's children. From generation to generation, this is a self-perpetuating covenant. And so I'm looking and I'm thinking, well, we see what God's part is. God's going to bless him in the city. He's going to bless him in the country. He's going to bless him in the fields. He's going to bless him in the house. He's going to bless him coming in and going out. And when the enemies of Abraham come out against him, they're going to have to deal with God. That's a pretty good covenant. For God's part, God is for Abraham. What's Abraham's part? All God said was, keep this covenant. And so I began to think about that. How come he doesn't list Abraham's duties under this covenant? And the more I looked at it, the more I look at it, and I look at it, and I look at it, and I pray about it, and I think about it, and I meditate on it, and I just roll it over, and sometimes I just go to bed and think about it. You know, sometimes you close your eyes when you go to bed, and these things that you've been studying so much and meditating on, they just come up before your eyes, and when you go to sleep, you dream about them. And I wake up sometimes, you know, you go to bed with questions, and you wake up with answers. And one day, just all of a sudden, it just dawned on me. This is not a contract or a formal agreement. The Old Testament concept of a covenant is not what you find in Black's Law Dictionary. Okay? Moses did not have Black's Law Dictionary. In fact, he didn't even use the word covenant. He used a Hebrew word. Covenant is an English word that kind of sort of means something similar, but it's not the same thing. And so what I began to understand is this, that the covenant of the Old Testament, the covenants that God made with people, the covenants that people made with one another, these are not simply formal agreements or contracts. These covenants are relationships. So that when God entered into a covenant relationship with Abraham, he said, for my part, everything I possess, I'm going to bless you with it. I'm going to give you prosperity. I'm going to give you financial freedom. I'm going to give you fortune. By that I almost said good luck. What I'm trying to say is that prosperity, not just financially, but his livestock, his crops, his family, everything that he does is going to prosper because he has God on his side. And so what is Abraham's part of this covenant? God says, I want you to keep this covenant. I want you to maintain your relationship with me. And that's the important point. That's the thing I want you to see right now, is that when God enters into a covenant with mankind, our part, and honestly, what do we have to offer to God? God said to David in the Psalms, he said, if I was hungry, I wouldn't come and ask you. What have we got that God needs? What he needs from us is a relationship. And that's the purpose of the covenant to begin with. He set up a covenant relationship. Now, we've talked about this before earlier on. The reason God made covenant with Abraham and made it this self-perpetuating type of covenant that has never been seen before on the face of the earth. He made a self-perpetuating covenant because he intends for Abraham to pass this covenant on to his son Isaac. Isaac passes it on to his son Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, and they are all involved in this covenant relationship. And out of those 12 sons of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, the children of Israel become a nation into which God then can send his son, the promised Messiah, so that Jesus can come and be born into a nation that is already in covenant relationship with God. So he's actually preparing the way. This is why when Paul talks about the covenant in the book of Galatians and elsewhere, he calls it the promise. He said the promise was made to Abraham and his seed. And then he makes very clear, he gets very specific. He does not say seeds, plural, or seeds as of many, but seed, singular, which is Christ. Okay? The seed of Abraham is Christ. God the Father is making a covenant relationship with Jesus of Nazareth, the man who is the promised Messiah. And in order for Jesus to receive that covenant and to actually be born into it, God goes back to Jesus' ancestor, Abraham, and starts the ball rolling several thousand years earlier, so that by the time Jesus is ready to be born, the earth has been prepared by the existence of the nation of Israel that Jesus can be born into in a covenant relationship with God. These are very exciting things. This is good stuff. We're going to go into much more detail as we continue on, but I thought this was a good place here to talk about what exactly do we mean when we talk about a covenant. And it's not a contract, and it's not a formal agreement. If you do this, then I'll do that, and if you fail to do this, then I'm going to take you to the courts, and the courts are going to uphold this contract. It's not like that at all. This is a relationship. When my wife and I got married, we signed a paper. We signed a marriage certificate, a license. We have it in the house somewhere, suitable for framing, and it has our signatures on it. It has the signatures of witnesses. It has the date on it. And somewhere in Madison County, Indiana, in the courthouse, is a document similar to that, less suitable for framing, that has the same signatures, the same date, and it says that at a particular time and a particular place, Roxanne and I entered into the covenant of holy matrimony. Now, that piece of paper states that on the 20th of April in 1996, Roxanne and I entered into the state of holy matrimony. But that paper is not our marriage. It is a record of the fact that a marriage was entered into at a particular time and place. But the certificate of marriage, the contract, if you will, is not our relationship. And if we take that piece of paper and tear it to shreds and burn it, if we move it to the attic and forget where it is and lose it, whatever may happen to it, if I take the wedding video and tape a ball game over it, I may be in trouble, but I have not dissolved the marriage, because the marriage is more than a piece of paper. It's more than a wedding video. It's more than a photograph album. Our marriage is a relationship, and it is a life-changing relationship. Okay, just like the adoption of a child. We have a child here with no parents. We have a couple here who want to add this child to their home. They go to the court system. There's a whole process. Money changes hands. Papers are signed. Officials come and look at your house. They do all kinds of stuff. And in the end, this child is brought into this family and becomes part of the family. He was not born there, but he becomes part of the family. He is joined into the family relationship. And so adoption is also a covenant relationship, and it is a life-changing relationship. When God entered into covenant with Abraham, it was a life-changing thing. It was very important, and Abraham understood how important it was. And he was able to convey that to his son Isaac, and Isaac to his son Jacob. And Jacob, in a way, was able to convey that to his sons. Now, we know that within the next several hundred years, the house of Israel, the nation of Israel, came into Egypt and eventually became enslaved and were in bondage in Egypt. And God had to send Moses to get them out and get them back onto that Abrahamic covenant and set them back on the road to the promised land. And the law was given to facilitate that rescue process and to make sure that the nation of Israel doesn't fall into problems again. Of course, they did, because these are only human beings. These are unborn again, unregenerate, old covenant people. These are not born again. They're spiritually dead, if we can put it that way. The new birth does not come into effect until the new covenant. We're going to talk about that in the episodes to come. For now, we're going to call this one just about done. Stay tuned. Keep watching, because these broadcasts are going to come out. Both the audio and the video are going to be available. Keep an eye on our website, davidlhenderson.com, and keep track of us, because we're going to keep adding and adding to the information we're putting forward in the Change of Covenant Academy. So God bless you. We will see you in the next episode.